They thought it was accidental, a lucky guess, a fluke, because to call it strategy made them feel safer. Strategy implies effort, planning, something they too could learn if they mimicked the steps. But what you did? That wasn't mechanical. That wasn't textbook warfare. That was an eruption of instinct fused with timing, unrepeatable by those who live on scripts and simulations. You made a move that broke convention, and because they couldn't trace the reasoning, they convinced themselves it was chaos. But it wasn't. It was precision wearing madness as a disguise. And you knew they'd call it luck, because labeling it genius would mean accepting you play a different game entirely. You didn't follow the rules. You didn't even rewrite them. You ignored them, and still made the board yours. That's why they stutter when they explain your success. They search for formulas in your wake, dissecting moves that were never written, only felt. Because they don't understand minds like yours, minds that don't rehearse, minds that react faster than fear, sharper than logic, louder than any inner critic. You walked into the fire without armor, but with one weapon: your nature. Not a role, not a plan, but a force. Strategy is for the structured. Genius? It dances with unpredictability and leaves no trail. They want to believe genius has a curriculum, that brilliance is something you can schedule between meetings. But what you carry is not teachable. It's primordial insight. It speaks to you from the marrow, not the mind. You knew when to strike because your instincts mapped the room before your eyes did. You read energies, watched for stutters in their rhythm, and struck before they even realized they were vulnerable. That's not something a seminar can explain. That's pattern recognition powered by pain. Genius like yours is built in silence, honed during years of being underestimated. And now it strikes with such elegance, it feels like coincidence, until the damage is irreversible. Let's be honest, most people fear this kind of genius, because it doesn't follow their protocols, it doesn't check in for approval, it doesn't need applause. You didn't wait for permission to think that far ahead. You didn't pause to ask if the idea was feasible. You executed it, and that's why it worked. Genius doesn't hesitate. It flows in the space between fear and impulse, and it doesn't ask questions on the way out. And while others were still calculating risk, you already moved 5 steps deep, without blinking. That's what burns them most. That their training couldn't keep pace with your intuition. What you did was a disruption in their perception of control. They thought they were dealing with a strategist, someone who thinks in frameworks, but instead they found someone who feels the battlefield, someone who listens not to rules, but to rhythm. Your genius came not from theory, but from trauma-mapped reflex. You weren't raised in comfort. You were raised in observation, in silence, in the brutal clarity of knowing that thinking too long gets you eaten. You didn't learn timing, you became it. And when you move, it feels like fate folding in your favor. But it's not fate. It's unconscious precision. They envy you in silence. They watch your steps, hoping to decode the formula. But you left no formula. You left shattered expectations, because they've never encountered someone who operates outside all known blueprints. You're not a chapter in their playbook. You're a glitch in their system. And that's why they either worship or demonize you, because those are the only options when someone shows up and does in moments what others couldn't in decades. You reminded them that genius disorients, that genius doesn't wear a lab coat. It wears scars and silence and grins mid-chaos. What you did shook their confidence, not because it was successful, but because it revealed how fragile their structures are. They needed it to be luck. They needed it to be unsustainable, because if it was genius, then they'd have to admit you saw something they didn't, felt something they were blind to, and most can't handle that. So they call it unpredictable, dangerous, reckless. But deep down, they know. They know you anticipated their collapse while they were still patting themselves for building the tower. And now, as the dust settles, they replay it over and over, hoping to find the thread. There is no thread, only instinct sharpened into weaponry. You don't brag, you don't explain. That's what scares them most. Because you're not trying to prove you're smart. You're simply being smart and letting the aftermath speak for you. That kind of composure, that silence in victory, it's haunting. It means you expected this. It means you've done this before. And when people sense that kind of unshakable core, they either kneel or conspire, and either way, it doesn't matter. Because your genius doesn't rely on their reactions. Your genius is internal combustion, triggered by need, guided by vision, and always underestimated. Until it's too late. This was never about the move, it was about the moment. And you seized it with the kind of clarity that shakes legacies. You saw the angle no one else did, and while they froze, you moved like thunder behind glass. Silent, violent, unavoidable. That's the thing about true genius, it doesn't have to announce itself. It changes the room, the air, the story, and when people try to explain it, they fumble, because no words can fully grasp what it feels like to watch the impossible happen. You didn't strategize, you saw, and then you acted, and that was divine disruption. They'll try to replicate it, they'll try to reduce it, but you've already moved on. Because that moment, that stroke of genius, it wasn't your peak, it was your proof. The proof that there's something in you that doesn't conform, doesn't seek, doesn't beg, something that simply knows. And now the world is trembling, trying to catch up to a blueprint that was never written in ink, but in fire. You were never playing to win. You were playing to remind them that some minds were not born to follow the steps. They were born to skip the line and rewrite the ending. Control was their god, their unshakable myth, their invisible fortress built on predictable outcomes, scheduled reactions, and manipulable minds. They thrive not by dominance, but by assumption, by the belief that they could calculate you. But then you arrived, and not like a warning, no fanfare, no build-up, just presence, quiet, composed, and surgical. Your movements didn't just bypass their rules, they collapsed. You walked in with calm steps that made chaos feel organized, and when you acted, it didn't just change the game, it ripped the board off the table. You didn't play within their power. You questioned whether they had any to begin with. They controlled people by routine. They predicted behaviors, framed situations, herded minds into corners built of fear, shame, and reward. But your presence shattered those mechanisms. You didn't flinch at the bait. You didn't dance for praise. You simply stared back, unmoved. And that scared them more than rage ever could. Because rage they could label, categorize, deal with. But composure born from clarity, that's the sign of someone who sees through the curtain and doesn't blink at what's behind it. You didn't obey their cues, and worse, you didn't try to overthrow them either. You just made their authority irrelevant. That's disruption. That's what makes tyrants tremble. When they say you're unpredictable, they're disguising their panic. What they mean is we couldn't break them. They thought they held the strings, but you walked in stringless. No need for belonging, no thirst for validation, just intent. That's what rewired the entire room. You didn't manipulate anyone. You rendered manipulation obsolete. Their tactics, based on scripts. And that's why no one could match it. They saw you smile at the storm they engineered, and it broke them. Because when control fails in front of its architect, it doesn't just crack, it implodes. They built cages with compliments, with status, with systems designed to measure who fits and who doesn't. And yet there you were, unmeasured, undefined, ungoverned. You weren't the anomaly in their data, you were the error that rewrote the algorithm. That's what shattered them. They spent their whole lives crafting formulas for influence. You burned through those formulas with presence. You didn't reject power. You ignored their version of it. And when people saw that, when they saw that nothing they dangled could tilt your axis, that's when fear became respect. Not because you demanded it, but because you proved you never needed it. You turned control into a mirror. They looked at you and saw their weakness reflected in high definition. Because you didn't rebel, you didn't scream, you disobeyed with elegance. You made their power look silly, not through war, but through indifference. They wanted a fight. You gave them irrelevance. And that's something no tyrant can handle, because tyrants feed on reaction. But you starved them. That silence, that smirk, that calm execution of your plan, that's what twisted their perception. Because now they question everything, every move they make, every glance you give. You infected their certainty with doubt. That's a disruption no strategy survives. They thought control meant they could forecast every outcome. They didn't account for someone who thrives in the gray. Someone who doesn't announce intentions, doesn't explain decisions, and doesn't respond predictably. They were used to pulling strings. You were made of smoke. They reached out, expecting resistance. You gave them nothing but inevitability. You didn't argue. You dismantled the entire dynamic by refusing to participate in their illusion. And now, their system, once so airtight, creaks under the weight of your silence. That's what real disruption is. Not a bang, but a breath they can't trace and can't escape. You didn't overpower them. You made them irrelevant. You were the silent atom bomb. No noise, no chaos, just a quiet release of truth that made their hierarchy fold like paper under flame. The genius in your move wasn't in how loud it was, but in how untraceable it felt. They don't even know when the tides turned. They just woke up in a new reality, and in it, you're the fixed point, the reference, the threat, not because you declared it, but because they did with their fear, their obsession, their scrambling explanations. They crowned you unknowingly by trying to contain what they never understood. There's a kind of violence that doesn't need fists. It's the kind that walks calmly into a system and breaks it simply by not believing in it. You were that violence. You stared at their empire and treated it like an old joke. They wanted you to submit. You smiled. That broke them. They wanted to provoke. You watched. That confused them. Every choice you made was a psychological blow. Not loud, not aggressive, just undeniably free. And that freedom, that's the disruption. That's the virus in their order. That's the reason they whisper when they say your name now. They don't fear chaos. They respect control. And what you did, what you are, challenged their very definition of both. You didn't just beat their structure. You exposed how fragile it always was. You didn't come with fire and fury, you came with clarity. And that's more terrifying than any weapon. Because now they know there's someone out there who doesn't flinch, doesn't fold, and doesn't play by scripts. Someone who walks through manipulation with immunity. Someone who moves like an equation no one can solve. And every time you enter a room, their sense of control bends. Not because you take it, but because you never gave it power to begin with. You broke more than rules. You broke their belief in rules. You redefined presence. While they were calculating compliance, you were calculating consequence. And your consequence was existential. You made them question if their control was ever real or just a spell they convinced others to believe in. And once a spell is broken, control dies screaming. That's why you're unforgettable. That's why they fear you, because you weren't a rebellion. You were a correction. The kind that doesn't ask, the kind that arrives.